Guessing not, but do you guys mind where we sit? Three sheets. Yeah, three sheets for stuff. Sorry, who are the 5 members? Cool. Resolve, the United States federal government should suspend all aid to Saudi Arabia until Saudi Arabia ends all of its military operations in Yemen. This is a policy around it should be weighed on the framework of net benefits from the lens of policymakers, the most fair, provide the most, both sides the best access to the ground. All definitions are contextual unless we're asked in PMC. The inherency. The first argument is the United States currently gives $7,000 in aid to Saudi Arabia each year. That's not very much. And that's going to be key to the way we frame our case later on, because U.S. aid to Saudi Arabia currently is not significant. Second argument, thus the plan, which is the resolution, the United States federal government should suspend all aid to Saudi Arabia until Saudi Arabia ends all of its military operations in Yemen. Questions?
What about new aid?
New aid?
Yeah.
Suspension.
Like in 50 years, if we decide we want to give them more aid, is the plan?
Well, it depends if they're still intervening in Yemen.
And assume they're not. Assume they are.
I'm going to assume it only applies to current aid. But, Fial would say that no new aid would be instituted during that period. So, solvency. First argument is this would not affect Saudi Arabia's intervention. Saudi Arabia doesn't care if we suspend $7,000. That's not very much money. The second argument is that Saudi Arabia, as a country, does not rely on the United States aid because it is wealthy from the oil, from all the oil it sells, which means that Saudi Arabia would not be materially affected by this policy, and the intervention in Yemen would continue unabated. Thus, advantage 1, which is Israel relations. The inherency. U.S.-Israel relations are bad in the status quo. The first argument is that Obama and Netanyahu have had a falling out. Obama was seen openly campaigning against Netanyahu and acting in support of his opposition in the election. So after Netanyahu won, Obama was kind of caught in a bad place because he had just campaigned for his opponent, which meant that because Obama lost that bet, the two of them are now quite at odds. In addition to the fact that Netanyahu has been seen as opposed to an Israel-Palestine peace settlement, which is a key policy position of Obama, this means that Obama and Netanyahu are unlikely to resolve the differences for the time being. Second argument is that specifically Israel views the United States as having divided loyalties. And the main thing that's keeping U.S.-Israel relations from succeeding in the status quo is the view that the United States in the region has divided loyalties, because in addition to funding Israel, in addition to supporting Israel, the United States supports Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region that Israel sees as opposed to its interests. Thus the links. First, the plan is a perceptual shift towards Israel. Even though the amount of money is not significant, the announcement that the United States is ending its aid towards Saudi Arabia is a shift and would be perceived as a shift towards Israel as the only major ally in the region. Second argument is that Israel would become the sole recipient of Middle East aid. Saudi Arabia is the only country that currently receives military aid, even if it is $7,000. So the title of being the only country in the Middle East region that receives aid, that receives military aid from the United States, the only country other than Egypt, would probably be significant, specifically with regards to Israel. Thus the impacts. The first impact is an Israeli preemptive strike. Israel is currently poised to strike Iran because they do not trust negotiations. Netanyahu has come out repeatedly to say that he does not believe the nuclear negotiations are going to work. This means the United States is key to check because Netanyahu sees Iran as an existential threat, and he sees that Iran's continued willingness he sees Iran's position in the nuclear talks as an existential threat because he does not believe the negotiations. He believes that Iran wants to blow up a bomb, and he believes that that bomb will be used against Israel, which means he's willing to go to extreme measures. The U.S. is the only thing currently checking that. This means that in a world when the United States loses its influence over Israel, Israel would launch a preemptive strike against Iran. This means that as a result of a strike on Iran, you would draw on Russia and China and the allies of Iran would like to counterbalance Israel in the region. This has a high potential for escalating because both Russia and China have very poor safeguards for the nuclear weapons. Only one commander is required to launch a nuclear weapon as opposed to 2 for the United States. This means there's a high possibility of launch. If one rogue commander decides that this situation warrants this would inevitably draw on the United States because he doesn't want to support its ally Israel as it's supported to do. This means that the war would escalate to extinction. Nuclear war causes extinction through nuclear winter. The detonation of bombs kicks dust in the air, creates large amounts of plasma, block out the sun, cut temperatures by 30 degrees Celsius for weeks on end, kills the ability for the earth to produce food, everyone starves. Advantage 2, soft power. Inherency, U.S. soft power is low. U.S. popularity worldwide has fallen. The U.S. is seen as intervention as power. The U.S. is not seen as popular, and this is key because the United States is increasingly losing the support of the population of countries, the inevitable consequence of which is that governments are voted in that are anti-United States. This is the trend we're we're seeing in every country. For instance, in Afghanistan, the country which we just intervened in, which we spent years doing publicity efforts in, they just elected a president who does not like us very much. This is the kind of thing that's happening worldwide because U.S. soft power is critically low. The second argument is that perception is that the main or the key internal link to low U.S. soft power is a perception that the United States cares more about allies than about human rights. Specifically, the U.S. is viewed as saying that just that human rights do not matter and it's willing to ally with any power if that power is strategically important, even if that power has a bad human rights record or a record of oppressing people. Thus the links. First, the plan ends official aid to Saudi Arabia. This is key because Saudi Arabia is the critical example used as propaganda to argue that the United States as a power is not interested in human rights. This is widely touted by the opponents of the United States, every political party from Greece to Afghanistan to every other country, saying that the United States doesn't care about human rights. Specifically, Saudi Arabia is known for brutal oppression of women and brutal restrictions on their ability to do things, as well as oppression of non-Arab minorities, of other ethnicities. All of these groups being oppressed and the United States continuing its aid means that there's an easy way for people to cast the United States as a hegemon that's not interested in people. The second argument is this signals a shift in United States policy away from hard power and away from an interventionist stance that's been taken for the past few years. A direct cutting of aid, and the press release and everything that indicates the United States is cutting all of its aid to Saudi Arabia is perceptually critical to make people, to give the perception and to create the perceived shift of the United States away from a policy of hard power and towards a policy of soft power and a policy of public diplomacy. Thus the impacts. First impact is rights leadership. The plan is to shift to a new role as the United States and a new usage for its power on the global scale. This means that if the United States shifts its policy in this way, it will be able to take leadership on issues like human rights. Currently, it can't do this because it's aligned with countries like Saudi Arabia that have terrible human rights record. It means it has very little credibility pushing on these issues. This means if the United States cuts off its aid to Saudi Arabia, that perceptually allows them to become a more important country in the fight against human rights abuses. That impact type 2 dehumanization and genocide worldwide. The second impact is key to check conflict. U.S. can act as a mediator across the Israel Iran strike scenario as well as many others for cases where United States soft power is key to check two powers and prevent the universal conflict. And the third impact is that soft power is the internal link to hard power. If the U.S. is not popular and the United States does not have government support, it can't have basing, it can't have the ability to project its hard power, which means that soft power, popularity, and being liked is an internal link to being able to project and use the United States power. Separate sheet for framework, or is it? Put them right. Excellent.
Observation 1 of the military bases do not constitute military aid. They said themselves that like the aid they're giving is only $7,000 a year. However, we have like military installations in Saudi Arabia right now. These do not constitute aid and are not like covered under the affirmative plan. Go on to the first off, which is solids. So basically what happens now, we can see aid is very, very minimal now. It's basically limited to just international military education and training. Basically what happened, we can see all of their link stories. Saudi Arabia won't weigh this like as more important than their gains from Yemen. However, what's very important is the reason why Saudi Arabia is so interested in Yemen. Here's the reason. Saudi Arabia believes that Yemen is being invaded by Iran. They're using evidence like the fact that there was a ship called the Jihan-1, which like had 185 tons of weapons and other things that were going directly to help the Houthi rebels. This ship came from Iran. It was seized in the harbor. In Yemen, and using this and other evidence, Saudi Arabia is intervening in Yemen to stop a perceived shift by Iran, like to try and gain control inside Yemen, which is along their borders. This is extremely important because what it means is that like Saudi Arabia is never going to end their operations as long as they continue to perceive that Iran is like trying to make territorial gains right along their borders. So this precludes other aid. So basically what this means here is that like if in the future, like 50 years from now or 20 years from now, there's going to be more aid, the plan precludes the United States from sending other aid if that aid is necessary. Now the problem here is Saudi Arabia is a very large country. It borders a lot of very other important countries. Look at the example of Desert Storm in 1991 where we used Saudi Arabia as a staging area to like help counter that. And so, because of the fact that the Middle East is a very conflict-prone area, the probability of this happening again is very, very high. The fact that we will no longer be able to rely on Saudi Arabia as an ally is a big problem for the United States in trying to stop these wars. Go on to the second one. Second off is politics. The plan is going to be seen as helping Iran. The Republicans really, really don't like the idea of helping Iran. You can look to everything that's been happening in the past few weeks about the nuclear deal. Even though the nuclear deal basically means Iran loses in every way, Republicans still don't like it because they see it as conceding to Iran. The plan is seen as helping Iran because we will be providing, we will be trying to stop Saudi Arabia from fighting Iran. That's the perception that's going to go here. It's not that we're going to stop Saudi Arabia because we like Israel. It's because we're trying to stop Saudi Arabia from fighting Iran. This is what the public perception is going to be. This is what the international, diplomatic perception is going to be. So the politics. Basically, what's happening here is that we are on a break with the Republican Attorney General confirmation. The new Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, is currently being held up by the Republicans, but the Republicans know in the status quo that this is a fight they can't win. So they are very, very close to holding this confirmation hearing because they know that this is a fight they can't win. They're going to get that those votes are going to happen. However, in the world of the plan, the Republicans get ultra, super, incredibly mad because they see the current president as conceding or acceding to Iran. As basically trying to help Iran. So what happens here is that they are going to just go insane, and they are going to block the Attorney General nomination. They're going to prevent any kind of other Democratic initiatives from passing. This Attorney General thing is particularly important because the new Attorney General has pledged to stop detentions of illegal immigrants happening when you catch them across the border. This is extremely important because they're being treated in horrible conditions. They're being treated left in depravity and treated with conditions that are so horrible to the incredible human rights abuses that we absolutely need these to stop. And the only way that's going to happen is under this new Attorney General using up what she has of her political capital. This is not going to happen, and Eric Holder has pledged that it will not happen under the current Attorney General. So instead of perceived human rights abuses that the AF is going to give you, we are actually stopping human rights abuses that are occurring inside our own borders. Let's go on case. Let's first to Israel. They're saying that the relations are bad now, and this is going to view the under the plan is going to view the United States as shifting Israel. Turn this argument. It's actually going to view it as shifting to Iran. We're going to be basically conceding. That we want Saudi Arabia to stop fighting Iran. That we want Iran to gain territory. This is going to be seen as conceding to Iran. And Israel views Iran as higher, as the opponents said themselves. Israel views Iran as higher on the threat level than they do Saudi Arabia because of their perception that Iran has nuclear weapons. Because of the fact that in their constitution it says we must eradicate Israel. So this perception is going to overwhelm any kind of perception that we're dropping our relations with Saudi Arabia. They're going to see it as helping Iran because Iran is so much higher on their threat level than Saudi Arabia. So you can turn this argument. Relations between the United States and Israel will actually worsen. So actually their impact comes not from the world of the plan, so their impact comes not from the world of the status quo, but from the world of the plan. Worsening the United States relations actually leads to this war faster, especially because we're actually not doing anything to contain the spread of Iran. Israel is going to see that we're not doing anything to contain the spread of Iran. They're going to be more likely to go for war. However, they're not going to go towards they're going to be more likely to go for war. If you buy that worst scenario is going to happen. But so basically nuclear agreements have happened before. That's never led Israel to war. They don't give you a credible story as to why that's uniquely going to happen next. So even if you don't buy the turn, you still see that nuclear war is a very, very low probability, especially with Israel. Second, they give you no confirmation, no evidence that Israel actually has nuclear weapons. Nobody's ever inspected these nuclear weapons. Nobody knows for sure that these nuclear weapons exist. The nation of Israel is maintaining their silence on this. There's no guarantee that these nuclear weapons actually exist. Go on to the second. Please. First, they're saying that perception is key. We help other terrible countries. We help the UAE, whose human rights abuses are even worse. We help Eritrea. We help most countries in Africa, where the human rights abuses, especially against women and ethnic minorities, are even worse than they are in Saudi Arabia. There's going to be no shift in perception. The United States is still going to be seen as aiding horrible countries, even if we stop aiding Saudi Arabia. There's going to be no increase in soft power. That means they can't access any of their impacts. So there's not going to be any shift away from hard power because everyone knows it's a small step. If it were a big step, maybe, but everyone knows it is a very small step. We in this room are not the only ones who know that.
Saudi Arabia is fighting in Yemen because they're believing that it's being invaded in Iran. First of all, okay, but this doesn't mean anything. Second of all, this doesn't stop our solvency. We still have solvency in multiple places. Third of all, saying that they're never going to leave the fight in Yemen also doesn't matter. So basically the only spot that they get to anything that matters here is that they talk about Desert Storm and how in the future we might need to intervene in conflicts again. So, okay, on Desert Storm, the first response is US bases are enough. We already have a lot of bases. They can see that. They actually tell you that we have a lot of bases in the air, and those bases are allowable under the resolution. These bases would be enough. They provide no warrants as to why we need more bases than that. Second response is intervention in the Middle East is bad. This turns basically their impact because we already say that hard power is bad. This hard power that they say, this hard power in the Middle East doesn't increase circumstances and ultimately leads to bad impacts.
Also, no access to hard power because soft power is the internal.
Yeah, they don't have any access to hard power because soft power is the internal link to hard power. I'll get to that. They brought that impact, meaning that ultimately you can't weigh their solvency for us. Going on to politics. So, first of all, it's politics DA. They basically just argue that we're going to trip something massive, that the Republicans are going to react to this really strongly. Okay, so the reason that Republicans won't react to this is that Iran negotiations would have already tripped this. If something was going to happen, Iran negotiations are a bigger step than cutting aid to Saudi Arabia. Also, the Republicans will be pacified because they'll know that Israel is now the only country other than Egypt being funded in the region. They'll see this as a move towards supporting Israel. They actually say nothing to that on case, meaning extend that. Okay, so going on to basically like framework that we have on our case, they agree with it, so just extend that. Going on to the first advantage, talking about Israel. So first of all, they put a turn on it saying that we're going to be seen as shifting to Iran and that this is going to cause Israel to go against us and basically to dislike us. So the first response to this is that it's not going to happen because the nuclear deals with Iran would have already been seen as basically like agreements with Iran or dealing with Iran. Israel's already upset with us, so there's no uniqueness on that, but ultimately what we see is that we do increase our support for Israel, or we see like a perceptual link to increasing our support with Israel because we're no longer funding one of their major disagreements. We're no longer funding Saudi Arabia, who they dislike intensely. Ultimately, they can see that they can see the link that says that if there's a perceptual shift to only aiding Israel, that we give more money to Israel, and this means that Israel thinks we're in more support of them. They can see that link.
They can see the uniqueness too, which means
and they can see the uniqueness on the advantage, meaning that it's true. So, on the turn, they also say, oh, Israel's going to go for war. They later then say Israel wouldn't go for war, but I'm going to get to why Israel would go for war. So on our impacts, they start talking about how nuclear war has a low probability. It still doesn't matter if its magnitude outweighs your true weight of risk. It has infinite risk of a nuclear war causing extinction. They don't really respond to that. Don't let them provide new impact analysis in future rounds. Second of all, they say that Israel doesn't have to nukes. This is completely ridiculous. First of all, Israel is recognized as having nukes. Second of all, they provide no warrants as to why Israel doesn't have nukes. Yeah.
by who?
What?
Recognized by who?
The international community?
That's not the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization, I think, is one of many international organizations that recognizes the obvious truth that Israel has nukes.
Okay, so
We should say this.
yeah. What's the organization?
The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization recognizes that Israel has nukes. This is better warning. That's also common knowledge. So going on to why Israel would actually have preemptive strike. First of all, Netanyahu has threatened a preemptive strike with Iran. It doesn't matter if Israel doesn't have nukes because our scenario doesn't actually say Israel uses a nuke. Our scenario says Israel goes into a war with Iran. Ultimately, when they do this, we're going to get involvement of Russia and China. They don't touch this on the links in the impacts, meaning that ultimately they can see that if Israel attacks Iran, Russia and China are going to get involved. This means that we get to Russia and China attacking Israel and Iran attacking Israel. Anyway, this hits the U.S. against Russia and China. Ultimately, what we see also is that they don't touch anything about safety in Iran or safety in Russia and China being problematic. That only one general is required to trip the switch, which means ultimately that they can trip the switch even if it's not like popular opinion. This means Matt doesn't check, and also it means that a nuclear war is possible. If there's this possibility, and they can see all the links to that possibility, this means that we get linked to an extinction impact, which they basically can see. Yeah.
Lastly, on the turn to the shift to Iran, aid specifically is key because we don't give Iran aid, which means that if we shift on the aid issue, that's only going to help the shift to Israel, not Iran.
Yeah. So jumping back up to the turn, basically, since we're not giving aid to Iran, we're only making a deal with them, Israel will still see it as a shift to supporting Israel. So I'm pretty sure that extinction scenario can be extended across the flood. Should probably be winning us the round. Going on to the second advantage about soft powers. First of all, they can see most of the transparency. They just say that we're helping other countries enforce human rights abuse. This doesn't matter because that just means it's a try or die scenario. We have the only chance of solving for anything. So even if there's only a tiny risk that we solve partially, only a tiny risk that we increase soft power, we're still the only side in the round that tries to do that. Second of all, this is sort of the entire argument that systemic violence extends. The reason you should prefer systemic violence is because what they're saying, that we can infinitely extend this, that we can just put it off because we should be worried about, oh, there might still be systemic violence, justifies putting off solving some systemic violence. If there's any chance that we solve systemic violence, you should immediately vote affirmative because that chance is enough to act now, and we need to act now in order to get to that. Okay, going down, basically they don't argue with any of the links here, they just say our inherency is wrong, so we don't get any links. We still increase soft power because ultimately Saudi Arabia is one of the countries known for brutal oppression and violation of human rights. This means that ultimately we're going to get impact, at least the international community sees us as a little bit better on the human rights issue. This means we get impacts to, first of all, the rights leadership. We can start leading campaigns for better human rights. They drop this. Since we give the link to it because their applications don't really apply, that means that we are solving for dehumanization and genocide, as my partner said. Second, mediation. We can mediate between different countries. Ultimately, meaning we can solve future conflicts easier and with less war. This impacts the death, meaning that there's less death in our side of the debate. Third of all, saying that soft power has an internal link. They've never refuted this, meaning that ultimately soft power is the internal link to hard power, meaning that their solvency price doesn't matter because they can't even go into those conflicts without having the soft power that they need. Meaning that ultimately, you're going to be voting ACT because of all the conceded offense on our case.
Order is off case and then on case.
Which one? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm assuming same order.
Yeah, same order. Solvency.
So, solvency price politics, and then
Israel's.
sweet.
Alright. So far, solvency press, our opponents basically refuted by talking about how U.S. bases were enough. However, the problem is, in Operation Desert Storm, we in fact used Saudi Arabia bases and we used Saudi Arabian forces to win the war. So basically this means that sometimes hard power is bad. Yes, hard power may be bad, but sometimes it is necessary, as in the case of Operation Desert Storm, when you have to go crush dictators and do the right thing for democracy. So yes, sometimes exactly, sometimes you don't have an option, you just have to go do it. So even though it may be bad, even though sometimes so-and-so people may view it as a bad thing, it is the necessary thing to do, and that is the right thing to do. Okay, second, politics. Our opponents basically talked about how these Iran talks have already tricked the Republicans into basically crossing this break. Yeah.
Question. Yeah, so considering that I haven't heard you read a link as to why we are in relations with Saudi Arabia, so what is that link?
You mean the link as to how?
Because you're saying that that we withdraw bases or that they don't let us use their bases. Why is that?
Exactly, because that limits our access
We're
to.
literally not allowed to aid them.
Exactly.
We're not allowed to train them, not allowed to help them, not allowed to give them intelligence. We're not allowed to do any of those things. That's your plan.
Exactly, so if we can't help them at all, if we can't provide any of our support in there, any of our aid, then that means that not only does it restrict our hard power into doing these future operations that may be necessary, even though they may be contentious, they may be necessary to preventing all systemic violence, deaths, destruction, and even possibly extinction. Alright, so going back to politics, our opponents talked about how the Iran talks already tripped this deal. The thing is, they haven't actually crossed the brink yet. Now, what will cross the brink is when we see that Republicans see Obama as helping Iran. That's the problem, because the Republicans are already mad enough that we are engaging in this talk, and obviously Israel is pretty mad about this too. The problem is, once we see that we are further conceding to Iran by withdrawing out of Saudi Arabia, and that we are not helping one of our biggest allies in that region by refusing aid, refusing all sorts of support, and that's going to push the Republicans over. Now, our opponents completely ignore the rest of our link, as well as the impact about systemic violence that are perpetuated onto undocumented workers. Because once the Republicans go over this break, they will basically go against everything that the Democrats put forward. This includes hiring the Attorney General, which is staunchly against the detainment of undocumented workers, which currently leads to massive amounts of systemic violence and totally outweighs the very unlikely probability of extinction happening. I'll go over that in the on case. But first, basically, so since our opponents never really contended this link nor the impact, we can see that this definitely stands, and that under the affirmation plan, this systemic violence continues. All right, going over the on case. First, Israel. Our opponents talked about how, once again, this deal signifies agreement. Now, the thing is, Israel obviously can get more upset. Israel is already very unhappy that we are even talking with Iran. The problem is, once they see that not only are we talking with Iran, but we are also pulling out of Saudi Arabia, then this is going to go even further into Iran's agenda. This is what Israel's perception of Iran is. It's going to put Iran, it's going to basically, it's going to push them, it's basically allowing Iran to do whatever they want, and basically, so yeah, it's going to see as we're basically giving aid, we're basically aiding Iran in whatever policy there is, and this obviously goes against both our relationship with Israel and it goes against our relationship with the Republicans. All right, so second, their link about basically Israel launching a preemptive strike. Our opponents talked about how Israel is threatening a preemptive strike and Netanyahu is threatening a preemptive strike. Kim Jong-un has also countless times threatened a preemptive strike against the United States, but that doesn't validate it anymore. Furthermore, the government of Israel has never confirmed nor denied the presence of nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons. None at all. Now, whatever committee our opponents brought up as proof to attest that cannot trump the fact that the government. Exactly. There aren't any inspectors that have actually gone into these facilities. Nothing can be more authoritative than the government's response, which is we can neither confirm nor deny that we have these weapons. Yes.
Sure. So considering that our scenario doesn't even rely on Israel launching a nuclear weapon, why does this matter?
Well, your impact of extinction, all this stuff relies on the fact that Israel launches a nuke, which then
launches a nuke.
Okay. Well, no. You said the Israel preemptive strike. That's what preemptive strike means. A first strike. It means you're going to go and blow up someone, and that will lead to China and Russia retaliating, which will lead to global nuclear war and extinction. Now the problem with this is that it has absolutely no links. Okay. Now I'm just going to go off of what my partner said. They have absolutely no link as to, first of all, whether or not Israel even has nuclear weapons. Second, whether or not they will actually carry out their intentions of having a preemptive strike. So we can see that whether or not how trigger happy China or Russia is, it doesn't really matter because number one, we don't even know if they have weapons, and number two, it's not unique because China and Russia, one of them could just decide one day to go and press it. It doesn't necessarily need an Israel preemptive strike. It could happen any day right now because China and Russia are plenty upset about the United States and an infinite number of other areas. All right, now finally, soft power. Basically, our opponents talked about how all these other cases don't really matter because we're talking about like a vast scenario. The problem is, number one, we solve for dehumanization. Now, the link that our opponent and impact that our opponents completely ignored about the dehumanization of these undocumented workers in the United States far outweighs their very unlikely chance of extinction because number one, Israel doesn't even have nuclear weapons, and number two, they might not. There's a high probability, even if they do, that they won't even use it. Means that we can see that dehumanization, which is actually currently existing in the status quo, and will currently exist under the that will be perpetuated forever under the affirmations plan. It's going to far outweigh any tiny little ability to basically have extinction. Yeah.
So you say that your dehuge outweighs our extinction, but the impact to disadvantage is not extinction; it's dehu.
Yeah. Okay. So how like soft power leads to hard power that leads to dehumanization.
Soft power leads to rights leadership, leads to dehumanization, which you conceded.
Okay. Well. Anyway, so basically this keeps on. Okay. So yeah, but the problem is this is non-unique. I don't see. We have plenty of other allies who do bad things. The problem is that is what we do. That is necessary. And the thing is that just because we relinquish Saudi Arabia doesn't mean that we relinquish all these other allies who have human rights abuses, women's rights abuses. So basically this is non-unique whatsoever because it doesn't just apply to our alliance with Saudi Arabia. It applies to a lot of other countries too. And obviously the affirmation plan doesn't talk about relinquishing control to all of this stuff. So they can't really have the impact of dehumanization because this impact is non-unique to begin with. And so for that reason,
starting on solvency, basically what we're saying here is that war is, they're saying intervention bad. We agree, intervention is usually bad, but war is sometimes necessary and we cannot leave that we cannot shut that door. Sometimes it is necessary and sometimes it will be necessary. We cannot shut that door, we cannot close off that option, extend everything I said in the 1 and C about how Saudi Arabia is uniquely suited to help us deal with conflicts because of their geographic location and because of their massive size. So yes, intervention is usually bad, but we cannot close that option we cannot close that door over means that the Attorney General nomination will not happen, which means we will not help anyone. We will not help anyone who's being dehumanized. All of these immigrants who are not being given proper human rights treatment in the United States. So what they're saying is basically that they can see this break exists, that the Attorney General will be nominated soon. However, any amount of Republican anger, that's linear. The more that they get mad, the more likely they are to not confirm the Attorney General. This is a linear impact, which means anything that we do to make the Republicans mad means that they are less likely to confirm this Attorney General. You have to weigh our dehumanization against their dehumanization. We are giving you basically a guaranteed risk of stopping or slowing this dehumanization because it's something we can control. It's directly within our borders. It's someone who is soon to be in a position of power who has made a promise to stop this dehumanization. The only thing they're giving you is that maybe the United States will possibly have better relations and maybe that will somehow stop some things from happening. They're giving you a lot of maybes, and that's why you have to weigh ours again. That's why you have to weigh ours more heavily than theirs. Go on to Israel. So first of all, extend all of our analytics about how we can't be sure if Israel has a nuclear weapon. No one has ever seen them, just because some people think they do. There is no confirmation that Israel has a nuclear weapon. Second, their nuclear war scenario does require Israel to launch a nuclear weapon. That is what they said in their 1AC. It does require Israel to launch a preemptive strike against Iran. That is what they said. It does require a nuclear weapon. So if Israel doesn't launch a preemptive strike, then all of their China and Russia scenarios don't work. Also, if it's so likely that a rogue general can just kill us all with one button, why hasn't it happened yet? They haven't given you a reason that whatever probability that is.
The argument that rogue generals launching nukes is inherently unlikely, completely new impact defense in the LOR.
Okay, you can think that. First of all, this is an extension of what he said in the 2NC. Second of all, I'm not trying to say that it was not, but I'm just trying to say that it's not unique. So there's a very big difference there. To my judges. So whatever the risk is now, they haven't given you a reason why the risk is going to change significantly in the world of the plan. So you don't really have to weigh this. Go on to soft power. Soft power is something that people seem to think that soft power is like playing Pokemon, where if you have more damage points than your opponents, then you will be able to convince them to do things. Soft power is not linear. Soft power is not continuous. We don't sign agreements with Iran because we have 8 soft power and they have 7 soft power. They need to prove that there is a they need to prove that there is a brink, that we are on the brink of becoming internationally recognized. They need to prove that we are on the brink of being able to change all of these problems. But we are not on the brink. We are so far away from that brink. We're practically at the bottom of the hill by now. So what's happening here is that we help other terrible countries. Saudi Arabia is by far not the only terrible country with lots of human rights abuses that we help and have helped in the past. Second, extend what my partner said, extend what I said about how we are not such a great country ourselves. There is so much work that the United States needs to do in increasing our international, the international perception of our respect for human rights, that they basically get zero access to this impact. There is so much work that the U.S. needs to do. We are not even close to a brink. This is not something that's linear. There needs to be a shift in perception that the United States is committed to stopping human rights abuses, and withholding $7,000 a year for one country isn't going to come anywhere near doing that. So let's weigh all of the impacts. Even if you don't buy the unlikeliness of nuclear war, buy the fact that it actually comes faster and more likely in the world of the plan. Because Israel, extend all my 1NC analytics that says Israel thinks of Iran as a bigger threat than Saudi Arabia. They will weigh the United States intervention, like the United States perceived helping Iran, much, much more than they will weigh the United States slighting Saudi Arabia. So actually, if Israel has nuclear weapons, which they obviously don't, but if they do, then the risk of an Israeli preemptive strike is much, much higher in the world of the plan than it is in the status quo. Second, weigh our dehumanization more important than their dehumanization because it has a much higher probability and it's something we can guarantee.
The order.
Don't correct the speech, please.
Sorry. The order is overview, advantage 1, solvency, press politics, advantage 2. interoperability, the politics story is terrible. I'll get onto that later. But that's the only real offensive argument they have in the ground. I'll get into the terms on advantage one, but really they have no probability for any of the links. And third is irreversibility, because extinction is just it. Extinction is the end. It means you have to prefer impact to deal with extinction, because in a world where everyone's extinct, nothing like dehumanization, nothing like any of these other impacts are possible or can happen. You're infinitely dehumanized if you're dead. That's as simple as it is, which means that extinction comes first. On Israel relations, their only real offense on this piece of paper is to say that somehow this plan signals a shift to Iran. I think we're winning some pretty convincing argument as to why this isn't true. First of all, we argue that the nuclear deal would have done this, that if shifting to Iran triggers the impacts of our advantage, then we would have already done that with the nuclear deal. This is some fairly compelling analysis they've conceded. Second, and most importantly, aid is the key link here. It's not just that we're generally shifting towards Israel, or that we're generally shifting away from Saudi Arabia. It's that we are specifically cutting our aid to Saudi Arabia. They have conceded the link that cutting aid to Saudi Arabia makes Israel one of the sole recipients of U.S. aid in the region. The argument is not, oh, like we generally shift towards Israel. The argument is specifically that aid to Saudi Arabia is the key thing that is blocking that right now. I'm seeing a lot of that analysis conceded, which means you have a pretty strong reason why our impacts here. Aid is the key link. They're not grappling at all with the analysis about how aid to Saudi Arabia being cut inevitably highlights the fact that we're still giving aid to Israel, inevitably means that it's a benefit to Israeli relations and not to Iran relations. Most importantly, however, look, we're in a negotiation with Iran that most people don't like, that Republicans do not want to happen. Like, if something was going to trigger a link that to increase relations with Iran, it would definitely be the current negotiations. On the impact defense, they say that Kim Jong-un makes lots of threats and therefore Israel's threats don't make sense. I say they've conceded our warranty in the LOC that says Israel is really serious about this because Israel sees Iran as an existential threat. Second of all, Kim Jong-un is not the same thing as Israel. Israel does not have the same kind of PR. Come on. Kim Jong-un makes threats every other week. The same is not true for Israel. This is a long-running threat they've been making for a long time. Probably means you're going to buy our impacts more. Furthermore, they say that Israel does not have nukes. Extend our CTBTO analysis that says Israel has nukes. Just because the government lies doesn't mean they get this argument. You can look it up if you want. Second argument is it doesn't matter. Our scenario is that Israel will attack with conventional weapons, and then Russia and China will retaliate with nuclear weapons. Which means even
that's not your scenario.
that is absolutely our scenario. What I have is that Russia and China specifically only have one commander needed to launch a nuclear weapon, which is why they are the countries that would launch.
Okay, your scenario, as it was explained both in the 1AC and in the 2AC, was Israel gives a preemptive nuclear strike, which leads Russia and China, or their rogue commanders or whoever, to launch a strike in return. That was the evidence that was given in both of those
Preemptive
cases.
strike,
I'm
not
sure you judges have the arguments on their flow. We'll review it after
Yeah.
under consideration.
I'll leave it to the judges. The scenario says preemptive strike, not preemptive nuclear strike, but even if you believe this argument, please look it up after the round. All you have is one warrant versus another here, means you should probably look it up to resolve it. CTBOTO outweighs because, hey, Israel might lie about its nuclear weapons. People do that sometimes. On to advantage, on to solvency press, actually. There's no real articulated impact to this, except that we might need to intervene in the future, but because they never tell you what the impact is, like what happens if we can't intervene, you're probably not voting on this piece of paper. Furthermore, we can say no link because they've never given you any explanation of why it is that Saudi Arabia, that cutting its aid to Saudi Arabia would actually reduce relations with Saudi Arabia. As a matter of fact, the solvency evidence in the 1AC says that we would not actually hurt relations because Saudi Arabia knows this is a symbolic step. Saudi Arabia knows that this is not actually, that the United States is actually not cutting itself off from Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia would not perceive this as a shift. Everyone else would. Furthermore, they've conceded that soft power is the internal link to hard power, which means that even if they win all this stuff about the need for intervention, our advantage too is going to be the main link to that. And they never give a term on back to player. Under politics, this is their main argument for offense here, but I think the argument that negotiating with Iran and engaging in talks with Iran is probably a pretty good thumper on this politics they said, because if talking to Iran and favoring Iran was such a bad thing, like the scenario just doesn't make any sense. Gut check this, please. That if we cut aid to Saudi Arabia, that is somehow going to make the Republicans angry because we're shifting towards Iran, whereas an actual initiation of negotiations with Iran did not do the same thing. It doesn't make any sense. Furthermore, they conceded the scenario is linear. They literally said linear means there's no uniqueness, means there's probably no impact to this scenario. On to finally soft power. The main thing here is they've conceded that Saudi Arabia specifically is seen as a key country because it's one of the main U.S.'s military allies and also has the human rights record. That combination means that Saudi Arabia is symbolically significant, even though the United States would maintain its aid to other countries. Which means that there's no way you're voting on any of their DHUM offense because we outweigh with the conceded impact of rights leadership that the United States is key to check oppression. Finally, on this Pokemon argument, they've conceded that Saudi Arabia none of this is going to apply. The main way you're voting here, though, is that advantage 1 outweighs the case, conceded way too much, the term doesn't make any sense, extinction network.
Alright, so whoever is the last person. Okay, 5-0 for the affirmative.
Now we will have to start making another tournament picture.
Alright, so I'll go first. Congrats everybody for getting this far, by the way. This is a pretty big deal in case you didn't know. So, congrats on making it this far. We'll see you back next year if you're not graduating seniors. So I'll go ahead and start. The round was relatively easy to interrogate, in my opinion. First place I look is to the disadvantage, or first I look at the solvency arguments. I think the affirmative does a sufficient job taking these arguments out, saying that soft power is going to be the internal link to being able to go back to Saudi Arabia to intervene in the future, and they also have decent enough defense that I think there isn't a significant impact here. Then I look at the politics disadvantage. So, at the end of the debate round, I am still giving you a linear risk of having access to the disadvantage impacts at the end of the day. All they have is this number analysis that they go really hard for and tell me you've got to check time and time again, but I think you might still have access to a break scenario on this. The unfortunate part is I'm not sure what the break scenario is. When presenting a good break scenario, you do exactly half of the work in this debate, which is to say why relations are bad, but then you also need to tell me the reason why they are holding steady in the status quo. I don't have a very well articulated reason why Republicans still have a backlash, and that is the second part of any clearly established break scenario. So, absent that, I'm not sure exactly how much weight to give this uniqueness break scenario, and I don't know exactly how much of an effect the plan passage will have. But I give this to you since the uniqueness is still going in your direction, and there's only a risk that the plan causes this. So, absent any real other substantive articulation from the affirmative team, I'm giving you a risk of the disadvantage impacts happening in systemic violence through ICD camps because there is horrible treatment of undocumented workers there. Alright, we have systemic violence, we have dehumanization on the disadvantage. However, I think that your strategy is a little bit tenuous when you are going for the analysis on advantage 2 that I shouldn't look to these long linear impact situations, and I shouldn't look to scenarios that are very long and linear, and that we should look to a clear bright line, because that's more or less what your disadvantage is. So at the same time, I'm giving you some decent game on all the defense that you're putting on advantage to a soft power, but at the end of the day, they're still getting the uniqueness question. Soft power is still low in the status quo, and the plan will still increase soft power to some extent, which means that there will be some risk of rights leadership by the United States, which could have a global impact in regard to decreasing some dehumanization. Very little weighing analysis is done comparing your dehuman impacts to their dehuman impacts, and I don't want to intervene, so I refrain from doing so on the level of dehum and chalk it up to probably roughly equal, which means I'm looking to extinction as a tiebreaker. I don't have extremely clear impact framing from any of the teams, which means that I'm not looking to extinction first in this round, otherwise it would have been a much easier ballot for the affirmative in this case, I think. So I'm just kind of looking at the numbers game and saying like, okay, there's a pretty improbable scenario for extinction, but it is still one more thing that the affirmative has that the negative does not have. So when we look to questions of extinction, I think you
will get mad because we're helping Iran somehow, but then you guys talked about how it would have been triggered by the peace deal, so it was watched from both sides. Advantage two, it went to the app slightly. Personally, I think more work could have been done on why showing like Saudi Arabia is a symbolic and specific reason, because I read the Daily Mail or whatever, which is like the British newspaper, and in the comment section, there are a lot of British people saying, how can the United States take this moral superiority if it's working with Saudi Arabia? And it had like a few hundred upvotes, okay? So this is like, Saudi Arabia is like symbolic, because this is an example, it's the example that people know about. And these are done more than that. But and their own term was on the dehumanization thing, on their disattitude, but since I dropped, I did not flow through their disattitude. They don't have defense, and you guys had some net offense, so I gave you guys an advantage too. Disadd one was the solvency press. Oh, okay, right. You guys talked about how we might need the base in the future. You guys talked about how intervention in Saudi Arabia is bad. I wish you guys went a little bit more into why specifically putting military bases and getting into and moving more into Saudi Arabia has been historically negative. If you guys talk a little bit more about that, that would be cool. You guys responded by talking about sometimes hard power is necessary. Big question